Good morning, friends. I'd love to talk with you all about love for just a few minutes. And I can't talk about love without talking about my babies. It is one thing to say that you love God, but the path to God goes right through humanity. One of the things that I know in this day and age, maybe even more than ever, is that lots and lots of people talk about their faith and how religious they are. But if you want to show me that you love God, show me what you're doing for God's children. And it starts with our babies. I've been fortunate to travel to around 40 different countries around the world, and I know that there's lots of things that we are not going to agree on. We may not agree on some political things, we may not agree on some economic things, but the one thing that I know in my bones to be true is that everywhere that I have gone, people love their babies. And they want the same thing for their babies as I do. They want food in their belly, they want a roof over their head, and they want dignity in their soul. And I used to know that up here until my baby Roya was born. And I thought I knew a thing or two about love. I had spent a couple of decades of my life reading books of love poetry and love mysticism. And then I held her in my arms. And when she opened up those eyes and she looked at me, something happened. And something keeps happening every time that she looks at me. Tonight is her prom. And I am going to leave y'all to go have a dance with my baby, because she still wants to dance with her baba. Right? I thought I loved my mama, and I do, and I thought I loved my baba, and I do. But when I held my daughter, my heart got bigger. I didn't love my mom less. I didn't love my dad less. The capacity to love grew, right? That's what Scripture means when it says, Alam nashrah laka sadrak, didn't we open up your heart for you? There is a love that opens you up. And then when my son, Amir, was born, he's now taller than me, he's got a beard, but he's still my little boy. And when I held him, I didn't love my daughter any less. The heart got bigger to encompass him. And then when my daughter Layla was born, when I met my beloved Corina, the heart keeps getting bigger. That's one of the teachings of the path of love. That love compels you to grow beyond what we've seen as the limit of ourself. We start to see love not as some emotion, right? As I sometimes joke with people, love is not an emoji, right? Love is not something you text people. And love is not even something that you feel. Love is actually the very unleashing of God onto this realm. It is the very being of the divine. And at some point we come to see that it's this love that brought us here. It's this love that sustains us here. And if we merge with it, this same love will carry us back home. Right? This is the path of love that all of our traditions teach, using different stories and different symbols. One of the things that I want to do is just to share a couple of teachings that have touched my heart, and I hope that they will also touch yours. So in our tradition, the Sufi context, they encourage you to think about how does your love lead you to serve people. If you love somebody, you serve somebody. And this was very real when I think about my own babies, right? Yes, they're cute and cuddly. They don't always smell good. And then they wake up in the middle of the night every 4 hours and they cry. When people talk about you sleep like a baby, that's what they mean. You wake up crying every 4 hours. And you get woken up, and in that moment, you're faced with a choice. You're tired, you're sleepy, you have not had 8 hours of sleep for decades. But your baby is crying, and at that moment, you don't sit there with a pro and con list. You don't rationalize. There's no intellect involved anymore. Your baby's crying, and love compels you to get out of bed and go pick up your child and hold her against you and comfort her. There is a love that transcends reason, and there's a love that even transcends choice. You've just surrendered to this love. Right? That's when you know that this love is washing you of your ego, of your selfish quality. And so the teachers of this path, and we're blessed to have two of them from two beautiful traditions on stage with us, they encourage us to think about, as the great song used to say, how deep is your love and how wide is your love? How wide is your circle of compassion? You got to love yourself. If you loathe yourself, you're probably going to loathe other people too. If you loathe the color of your skin, the texture of your hair, the shape of your nose, or in my case, the lovely round way that God made me, you're probably going to hate a few other people who resemble you too. But if the circle of your compassion only extends to yourself, well, congratulations, you're a narcissist, right? If love compels you to project yourself beyond yourself, and you love your baby, you love your mama, you love your baba, but you say, oh, I'll love, but I'm only going to love my family and nobody else. Okay, congratulations. You've transcended narcissism and you're stuck at nepotism. Then sometimes love compels you a little more and you say, okay, I'm willing to love everybody that looks like me. I'll go beyond the family. Look, everybody, congratulations, you're a racist. Clap for yourself, Love compels you to grow and say, you know what? America. Love everybody who lives inside these imaginary lines. Congratulations, you're a bigoted nationalist. You say, I will love everybody who bows down and prays to God or goddesses the same way as I do. You're a religious bigot. What if love compels you and to say, one God, one humanity, and that the same one God who loves, who creates, who feeds, who nurtures, who redeems, and who calls us home, compels us to swim in this cosmic current of love with absolutely no exceptions. That we love for every sentient being. Every blade of grass, every tree, every flower, every human being, born and unborn, past and future. That's a love that's like sunshine. That's a love that's divine. And that's the love that we're called to participate in. The teachings of our traditions also tell us that this love is divine. The Prophet Muhammad has a beautiful saying in which he encourages us to think about the ways that God introduces himself to us. We're told that God has 100 names, 100 qualities. One of them is hidden. There's always something that's hidden, right? The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. In the Jewish tradition, we've even forgotten the real vowels and how to pronounce the name of God. The Holy Grail has to be lost, so we go searching for it, right? And in Islam, we're told that there's a name of God that's hidden, but the other names we're told about. And when you start studying the Quran, the beginning of every chapter, except one, starts with these same two divine qualities, Rahman and Rahim. Rahman and Rahim, the infinitely merciful, the especially tender. The infinitely merciful, expansive and wide, and the laser beam focus of loving tenderness. God has 100 qualities, 100 names. And think about all the different qualities that you and I have, right? I am a son, a partner, a father, a student, a friend, a teacher, a neighbor. I have a name that my mama gave me. And what would it be like if when I meet you and you're like, tell me something about yourself? And I keep telling you the same two things. I am Roya's Baba, Roya's daddy. And I am Ali and Puran's son. And then I meet somebody else. Tell me something about yourself. I am Roya's daddy, and I am Ali and Puran's son. If I do that 100 times over and over again, you'd be like, yeah, I guess these are two things that are really important to him. And of those 100 qualities of God, the all-knowing, the all-just, the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, the manifest and the hidden, the two qualities that God wants to introduce himself herself by, the infinitely merciful, the lovingly, specially tender. You would think these are important qualities for understanding God. Arabic, just like Hebrew, sacred language, which operates on a root system. If you want to know the meaning of a word, you got to go into the roots. It's like a tree. You got to dig a little deeper. And the roots of a word are what gives you the heart meaning, the essence meaning. I remember when I was trying to teach my son about Rahman and Rahim, and these words, compassionate and merciful, didn't mean anything to him. They're like, and he would almost say it sarcastically, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Eye roll included. And then I remember that teaching from the prophet that said, these two qualities of God, the Rahman and the Rahim, come from the word Rahim, which means a womb. A womb. So think about this. We are told in our faith tradition that the divine transcends gender. God is no more he then God is she. And there are masculine qualities and feminine qualities. But so many of the names that we use come from the masculine side. God the king, God the ruler. In some languages, not in Islam, God the Father. People have no problem, our Heavenly Father, and then if you pray in the name of our Heavenly Mother, they have a conniption. They're like, why are you projecting gender onto the divine? I'm like, you've been praying in the name of God the Father for centuries, right? Well, that's separate. The Prophet says, and later mystics like Ibn Arabi say, these divine qualities of Rahman and Rahim, the compassionate and the especially tender, come from the root of a womb. And then they add, it is as if, كأن, it is as if we are contained inside the womb of the Divine Mother. It is as if you and I and the whole cosmos is contained inside God's womb, the ultimate maternal symbol. Where I want to end and introduce the conversation with our friends is this. So much of the time when we pray to the divine, we look up, as if we are praying to a God who is up there and out there. The feminine aspect of God allows us to change our prayer. There is no divine that is out there outside of us. We are praying from the inside. We are already inside the divine womb. And in the same way that a mother loves, nurtures, cherishes, and provides for an unborn baby, that is how intimately we are sustained by a divine mother. Without this feminine dimension of the divine, we have half a religion. Let us have a whole faith. If we strive to be whole human beings, let's have a faith that is whole. Then may it be that the circle of love, the circle of compassion, encompasses all of us, even as we are already inside God's womb. With your permission, we'll now turn it over to our two wonderful teachers that we have, Jamal Nur Hoja and Rinpoche. Bismillah.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's fantastic to be with you, especially here with Thupten Jinpa, who is kind of a mystery man. You know, it's like everybody around the world recognizes him as the man at the side of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, whispering into his ear. And then His Holiness always says these amazing things that people are hanging on to every word. And sometimes I've wondered, are those your words or his words that he's saying? So we're so delighted that you're part of the festival here. And we've been having wonderful talks, obviously, His Holiness, principal value that we spoke about, really that inspired our city, is the value of compassion, We call it the human value, and how all of us here in this room and those of us that have the beauty of having leadership positions use our pulpit to preach every day, if you will, around these human values of kindness and compassion, love and hospitality. And those are what bind us all as human beings. We're born with these, and then people kind of get caught up in the secondary differences, it seems like, that are attempt to pull our cities and our country and our world apart. So we're just going to have a conversation. And Jinpa, so I'd like to ask you a few things. I mean, one of the things that you said is, quote, compassion, it really opens a whole new door to the way of being in the world. And you've traveled the world with His Holiness. And can you talk to us a little bit about what you meant when you wrote that?
I mean, of course, I've had the privilege to serve His Holiness for such a long time, and also originally having brought up as a monk, I had the privilege to also try to live according to that value. So, of course, my thinking and my belief, my own way of life has been heavily shaped by, the inspiration of His Holiness. What I see in compassion is actually a very important human resource that often we neglect, to our own kind of, peril. Because, what I find fascinating about compassion is actually the role it can play in motivation. Because when we act, we have all sorts of motivations of a sense of justice or outrage or jealousy or greed but compassion is also part of that. But if we choose compassion to be our key motivating factor, say for example, in our relationship with our children, the way we treat our colleagues at work, and so on, it changes everything. Because then you're free from this heaviness of self-agenda and defensiveness and judgment, and you have a kind of a clarity. And I often say that if you are struggling with a moral issue, the clearest way to think through this is to ask, what is the most compassionate thing to do here? It really has an amazing ability to be so clear. And this is what I mean. When you choose compassion, it really opens, a whole new set of doors.
Well, so this is something that, when we've talked about it here, some people say, well, that sounds great, but it sounds soft. And, we don't live in a soft world. And so it's too touchy-feely and we can't get things done. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, actually, you know this. I mean, one of the things that I really admire about you is you as a mayor of a major city in North America has made the conscious choice to make compassion as an explicit value by which you will, exercise your leadership of this city. And in the end, we realized that regardless of how, important federal level governments are or state level governments are, in actual reality, people's lives are impacted by what happens in the city in which they live. And the reality of the modern world is that most of us tend to live in urban areas. So the kind of leadership that you are exercising really makes a huge difference. And by choosing compassion, you're not saying people can get away with everything they do. You want to make sure that the individuals take responsibility for their action. There is a law and order. There is accountability to people's work. But at the same time, you find a place for compassion to be a powerful voice. So that compassion is not a touchy-feely thing.
Yeah, there's compassion at the individual level, but we have to have compassion to the system, right? In this case, the system is our city, and we define compassion as respect for citizens so that their human potential is flourishing.
Sure.
But that can only happen in a context where a system is flourishing.
Definitely.
So if there's, let's talk a little bit about violence and compassion. We have increasing problems of violent crime in 3/4 of American cities right now. Mainly due to the scourge of opioids and heroin. And how do we go about to exercise this value of compassion within this kind of environment? And so to me, we have a systemic or a citywide view where there must be justice. There has to be individual accountability for it as well, for the overall system of compassion to flourish. Does that make sense?
Yes, actually, I wanted to ask you a question so that it's not just me at the receiving end. You were there at this very important, mayor's conference in Indianapolis last year. So I was kind of curious because you and one of the few mayors have chosen to declare your city as a compassionate city or city of kindness. So my curiosity is, I'm sure that the mayors of other larger cities are intrigued. So when they ask you questions, what do you say? What does it mean for a large city like Louisville to be declared as a city of compassion? What do you say to that?
I usually chuckle like that at the beginning. A lot of people don't understand it. In this world of elected officials, many people, I have a business background and I've always run our businesses so that compassion is at the heart of that, with, again, the respect for all of our employees, our citizens, so that our companies are platform for human potential to flourish. So this concept is a city concept, with the city as a platform for human potential to flourish. And so everything we do works up around that. So we make our decisions first through values of lifelong learning, health, physical, mental, environmental, spiritual health, and then compassion, this respect notion that we talked about. So I haven't found anybody that disagrees with it. When we talked about it at the beginning in my inaugural address, some people said, that's soft, that seems weird. Politicians are supposed to be hard and tough, and compassion is soft and weak. And I said, well, actually, it's harder to be compassionate than it is to be a cynic from the couch somewhere. So let's get with it here. It's an action word. So, but then we say, how do we bring it to life? Because if it's just theory and philosophy, as you know, it doesn't work as you integrate how to build a city. So we bring it to life, and this is usually what I talk about with mayors. First, do something symbolic. It has to be in your heart, but then sign the Charter for Compassion, for instance. But then get started. Do something. So the first thing we started was service work. It's the most basic thing that everybody understands. It connects people from different parts of town. Makes people feel good when they serve and love other folks, lead to other good activity. We're in our Give a Day week of service right now, as a matter of fact. And last year we had 175,000 volunteers in acts of compassion. This morning I started off with an event where we had 300 volunteers going to help in the Shawnee neighborhood of our city. They all showed up despite the rain and cold weather out today, because the drive for compassion, I think, was very positive. So that's the most basic form, but then we've matured into the area of education, in particular focusing on our youngest citizens. When you think about some of our disadvantaged kids that come from basically post-traumatic stress environments, food insecure, housing insecure, very likely would have been around violence, and they show up at our kindergartens and we drop them off to a teacher and say, okay, now teach this kid. That's a disservice to education, it's a disservice to our teachers. So we started the Compassionate Schools Project so that we could teach nutrition, wellness, mindfulness, so kids could learn empathy, compassion for selves, compassion for others as well, and it's increased educational outcomes and human potential as well. So I go to the specific areas with these mayors to say, here's how you bring it to life. And I know His Holiness's emphasis has been on education a lot.
Definitely, yeah. So, I'm sorry to say that His Holiness has not been able to come to this year's Festival of Faiths. He was looking forward to it. And yesterday, listening to the presentation on the Compassionate Schools, and there was a lunch where Owsley actually explained much more detail about what's happening. I felt that what a pity that His Holiness would have really been so impressed and pleased by what you have achieved in the Compassionate Schools project, because the fact that there is such a scale, so many schools are involved. UVA is involved, and some of the local universities are also involved in the evaluation and research side. So all of this is probably been made possible because there is, from your office, a kind of a very strong support of the whole notion of compassion as a guiding principle and value. So I told Owsley that I wanted to a one-page summary of the Compassionate Schools project so that I could inform His Holiness that a lot of good work is being done, because His Holiness has great fondness for you. Those who see the two of you interact immediately notice this. And because he sees you as someone who actually makes the ideal of compassion real in people's lives. So let me take this opportunity to thank you and congratulate you for your leadership. Yeah. Maybe, one thing, I'm a Canadian, so I'm on the other side of the border, the northern side, the colder part of North America. One of the things that, we have noticed lately, particularly in the US, is this increasing kind of, discourse that has to do with the relationship between communities and authorities, and particularly kind of, law and order authorities. There have been some tragic situations. So, my hope is that Louisville, with an explicit espousal of compassion as a guiding principle of the city, maybe it could set an example of how, even in the case of difficult relationships, like law and order and community relations, maybe there's a way in which compassion can play a role. Do you see that a possibility?
I hope. I mean, one of the biggest challenges is to get people to think. It came out in our last example as well, our last panel as well. You have to stop and say, why are things happening the way they are? And it's because the systems that we have in place, policies, procedures, and laws, have produced a certain effect. When you look at the root of most injustice, whether it's on the violence side or lack of opportunity side, it stems from poverty. So when you take a look and say, why is there poverty? And you take a look at our institutions, our structures, and the history behind those, many of them were not developed to produce access, equity. And so we have this growing gulf between those that have it and those that don't. In many cases, it's multi-generational. In many cases, it's a result of racial policies that have been put in place in our country. Of course, we have the stain of slavery as part of the history of America. And we can't do anything about that, but we can change systems moving forward. When you have multi-generational poverty, especially in urban areas, if your family has never been able to integrate into education, into healthcare, because the systems were not there for you to do it, and you hear people saying, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The reality is a lot of people don't even know where the shoe store is. Okay, so we're investing in the wrong place. For that young boy that I talked about that's showing up 3 years behind in kindergarten, why aren't we investing in him from prenatal to age 6? As a society, we seem to be okay to invest in incarceration and after the fact.
That's true.
In healthcare. So the same with healthcare, education, it goes on and on. So I think that we are at the beginning stage of some type of change in the social contract that we have here in America, because our system right now is not sustainable in terms of equity and opportunity for everybody. The results are too varied. If I can't convince people through the heart that it's the right thing to do for everybody to have a shot at success, then we talk about the economics. We're going to be a majority-minority country in 2040. Where's the workforce going to come from if people don't have access and equity? And if I can't convince you on that, then the other argument is public safety. The riots that took place in our country post-Ferguson, while they're initiated by an officer-involved shooting, what the street is saying, I feel disconnected, I feel hopeless to a positive future. We cannot build a great country around that. And the street will react, just like you saw in the Middle East, and it has been. So there will be an awakening. The question is how much pain and frustration between now and then. So I'm optimistic, and there's other countries, as you know, that are showing us the way. So we've got to look at our systems.
So it looks like that kind of change really is most effective when it's really at the grassroots level, from a level of city. This is why I think His Holiness was particularly inspired by a few of you really adopting compassion as an explicit value, because there is a real chance. So the question I have is that after having declared compassion as a kind of a key value and Louisville as a compassionate city, have you been able to attract some of the businesses into the city so that they feel somehow they can sort of be imbued by these kind of values?
Yes, and this is the last question I'm going to allow you to ask me. I'm supposed to be interviewing him. I'm the local guy. They hear from me all the time. That's a great question. The Compassionate Louisville Partnership, and I'm sure we have some folks here, we have education constellation, healthcare constellation, business constellation. Tom Williams has been very important in that.
By the way, I was very impressed by the amount of corporations that have supported the Compassionate School project. Yeah.
Corporations, we have over 100 people that have companies that have signed our Charter for Compassion. ComputerShare is a big company here. We'll have over 1,000 employees in the next couple of years. We were competing with 40 other cities. Great company. I asked the CEO, why did you end up selecting Louisville? You know what he said? I loved your city's focus on compassion.
Wow.
So compassion is good for business.
It is.
And like I said, lack of compassion is bad for business as well. So however you enter the conversation, it's all about, we were saying earlier, Jinpa didn't know that Thomas Merton had his epiphany at 4th and Walnut, now Muhammad Ali, just blocks away from here. And so high performers understand that interdependence and interconnection is essential. And of course, the most highest performing entity is Mother Nature, right? And when we don't please her, bad things happen. And this, of course, is what we were talking about as well. But you've had an extraordinary life from a young boy in Tibet that met His Holiness in northern India when you were 8 years old?
6 years.
6 years old. You were selected to greet him when he came to your school, walked out of the school holding hands with him, and who knew what your life was going to become from Tibet to northern India to Buddhist monk to England to Montreal to over 30 years translating for His Holiness. And what a ride you've been on to have this great perspective of what the world has to offer. So in our closing 2 minutes here, would you mind just sharing with us all this exposure you've had to everything? What are the top learnings that you've learned from His Holiness?
Well, I have been very, very fortunate, although, a victim of what happened to Tibet tragically in 1959 with His Holiness having to escape to India. My parents joined that Tibetan exodus. But although I grew up as a refugee kid in the in India, in the Tibetan community, but I've been very, very lucky. And I often tell my friends and my wife as well, many of us have the illusion that somehow we have some control over our life. But the fact is, the most important things in your life, you don't choose. You don't choose your parents, and also the person who you end up living your life with. Often you don't choose because you fall in love. Similarly, with His Holiness, it was not really a choice. I didn't really have a grand plan for my life. It just unfolded, and I was wise enough to follow the path that opened in front of me. That's the only wisdom I can claim. But with His Holiness, one of the things that I've really learned a lot from him is the importance of remembering that life is as much about suffering, challenges, and problems as about joy and happiness and fulfillment. We sometimes forget. People who are serious, who are committed, who are dedicated to a cause, forget the joy side of things. And with His Holiness, you can see in him, here is a man who's totally at ease in his skin. In his own skin, he's who he is, he's what you see in front of you. There's a kind of a relaxedness. So this being able to combine dedication, effort, facing the challenge, feeling for the world in pain, sharing the pain, at the same time being joyful, celebrating life, really celebrating your fellowship with other human beings. That kind of maintaining the optimism is so important, and this is something that I've learned from His Holiness.
And what about the laugh?
Exactly. I mean, he has a tremendous sense of humor. We all know. I mean, it's like, it's quite infectious. Yeah.
Well, and so when he visited the first time, they said, don't touch His Holiness. He's very important and holy man. Make sure you stay away. And then he walks in the room and he throws his arms open and he has a big belly laugh and he starts hugging everybody. It was very confusing.
Well, the Tibetans, we see him as the human manifestation of the Buddha of compassion. So, of course, the Tibetans have this deep reverence. So people around him try to somehow protect him, but then he is who he is, He's just basically a human being who just likes physical contact and just to be joyful.
Yes. Well, it's been such a blessing to have a relationship with His Holiness, and we see him as such a motivation for our city to do better. We will redouble our efforts as a city of
I think
compassion.
he will be very pleased to hear about the report that you will have to give it to him.
Well, then let's bring him back to Louisville.
Exactly.
How's that sound?
I'm standing before you at another awful time. There's been more Islamophobia now in the United States since 9/11, this last year. And you may notice I am struggling with a very bad cough, and I've just had some stuff given to me for it, but Tori noticed that the cough started just about the time when Donald Trump was landing at the airport. But it's really great to be here in Louisville. I've enjoyed my visits here before, but this time coming back, it's very special because Louisville has become absolutely central to our project for building a network of compassionate cities. Louisville has become one of the best of our cities, determined somehow to implement, to insert the difficult virtue of compassion into the gritty reality of urban life in the 21st century. And it's absolutely crucial. That this is done. Because if compassion remains simply an airy notion, sort of kumbaya, a soft option where people are just nice to one another in their private lives, and somehow do not make it work politically or socially, I really feel we have very little hope of handing the next generation with a viable world. Because I've come to the conclusion that compassion is not just a nice idea, it's now an urgent global imperative. I came to this with difficulty. I had not experienced religion, for example, as a compassionate enterprise, to put it mildly. But I wrote a book called The Great Transformation, when all our great world religious traditions came into being at about the same time, in India, in the Middle East, and in Greece, in Europe. And every single one of them, in their own way, quite independently, came to the conclusion that the bedrock of spirituality and ethics was what we now call the Golden Rule. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. And insisted that this, and not a particular belief or a doctrine or a political position, this was at the heart of all our religious traditions. It was the test of true spirituality. And yet, I was getting frustrated because you heard so little about it. Very often when religious leaders come together, they were often here to condemn something, like condemn homosexuality, for example, or coming to profess a particular doctrine. But you didn't hear about this one thing that the world needs at the moment. Because unless now we learn to implement the Golden Rule globally, and it begins in cities, I think, the world is simply not going to be viable for it, because we've not done it in the past, and we're now beginning to reap some of the rewards of this. The Golden Rule requires you to look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. One of the first people to propose the Golden Rule in a way that was written down was Confucius in the 5th century BCE. And he said, you do this all day and every day, not just when you feel like it. It has to become an absolute habitual practice. In England, we have a habit when we've done something nice for somebody, we often say, well, that's my good deed for the day, as though we can then return to the next 23 hours to our usual habits of greed and unkindness and bitterness. No, all day and every day. And it requires you to transcend the self. That is why it's so important in spirituality. Now, they all insisted too that you could not confine this benevolence to your own particular group. You had to have what another Chinese sage called yan ai, concern for everybody. You have this in the monotheistic traditions too. Love the stranger, the foreigner, says Leviticus. If a foreigner lives with you in your land, do not molest him. You must treat him as one of your own people and love him as yourself, for you were strangers in Egypt. And here you have the logic of the Golden Rule. Remember the times when you were a despised, oppressed, marginalized minority in a foreign land in Egypt, and make sure that nobody in your vicinity, in your own country, has to suffer such pain in your society. And the word love, I think, needs decoding here, because one of the problems we're having with compassion is that it's got kind of soft and mushy, a bit full of kumbaya, and that this toughness tends to be dissipated. Love, for example, in English has got really debased. You know, I love ice cream. Didn't you love that movie? Or else it suggests a sort of great welling of emotion. But in the ancient Near East, the time Leviticus was written, love, hesed in Hebrew, was a political term, political legal term used in treaties, international treaties. Two kings who may have been enemies previously would promise to love each other. And that didn't mean that they would fall into one another's arms and become best friends, best buddies. Love meant loyalty. It meant that they would look out for one another's best interests, even if this went against their own short-term goals. That they would come to their aid of their new ally when he was in trouble. And they would do all they could to give him practical help and support. Now, this is the kind of love we need to give our so-called enemies today if we want a peaceful world. And Jesus said, love your enemies here. And the fate of Jesus reminds us that compassion can be dangerous. Here's a man who, in the Gospel of Mark, at the end of chapter 1 of this earliest of the Gospels, is so besieged by suffering, desperate people that he can't leave the city. we sometimes read the gospel piecemeal in church. We don't get the full effect of this. Jesus is claustrophobically surrounded by suffering people at the end of their tether. They're sick, they're blind, they're deaf, and many of them are deranged, demented, filled with what they said devils. And the gospel says that they are struck down with the Greek words used mean that he looked at them and he saw that they were hard pressed, and the Greek words used means with imperial predation. Jesus was a political figure, and he was killed by the Roman authorities for asking for a fairer, more compassionate world. And other people we've seen in the 20th century, Dr. King, Gandhi, who preached the compassionate ethic very effectively, but paid the ultimate price. So in becoming a compassionate city, one's taking on a great risk and a great challenge, and it won't always be easy. It's not about being nice. I personally am not filled with peace and love and joy. If I'm filled with anything, it's a kind of dread. I never intended to get into all this business about talking about religion or writing about Islam. My goal was to be a university professor teaching English literature, and it didn't happen. But a turning point for me was during the Salman Rushdie crisis. And there, if you remember, the Ayatollah Khomeini, on his deathbed, his government had issued a fatwa saying that the Salman Rushdie and his supporters and his publishers could be killed. This was outrageous, went against major Islamic and indeed Iranian Shiite ideology. And of course, I was dead against that. But I was also utterly horrified by the way the liberal intellectuals of Britain, and these were not just little unknown people, they were major novelists, philosophers, intellectuals, and journalists, segued from an out-and-out denunciation of the fatwa to a denunciation of Islam as an essentially evil and bloodthirsty religion. And I remember sitting surrounded by the Sunday papers and thinking that this reminded me of the 1930s and 1940s. It was this kind of rhetoric used by Hitler that had made the concentration camps possible, by dehumanizing. And at the end of that decade, at the end of the 90s, there were concentration camps again around the periphery of Europe, this time with Muslims in them, in Bosnia. So there's that kind of dread and urgency I have. So, as I say, it's hard work, and we have somehow to find a way to grapple with the political realities of our time and make compassion, to feel with the other, to treat others, all others, as we would wish to be treated ourselves, a real reality. If we British had behaved with more respect to the people in our colonies during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, we would not be having so many political problems today. Things are coming back to haunt us. Now, the people who founded the Golden Rule, started it up, were all living not in peaceful, idyllic groves. Like Jesus, they were living in times where violence and injustice and suffering had reached an unbearable crescendo. China, for example, at the time of Confucius, was just embarking on a terrible period of Chinese history. It's often called the Warring States period, because for over 200 years, all the states, the small states on the big Great Plain of China, fought one another with desperate, terrible casualties for over 200 years, most of the casualties among the peasantry. until there was only one state left. The others were all destroyed, and that became the Chinese Empire. And Confucius his golden rule was not just a private imperative, though it was that too. His whole life was spent tramping from one court to another, trying to make the rulers of China observe the golden rule. Because he said, if we don't behave to each other as we would wish others to behave to us, we will destroy one another. And that has never been more true than it is today. A little while ago, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, I did a video link up. I think perhaps it was with this festival in Louisville. And I was in London at home and was speaking to an audience somewhere. And somebody asked me, what should a compassionate city look like? What should it be like? And I said, a compassionate city should be an uncomfortable city. Why? Because, and here, I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but I believe the Prophet Muhammad once, peace be upon him, once said, not one of you can be a believer if he can sleep when he knows that someone is hungry. And we know, because we are inundated with images of suffering and pain more than any previous generation. We know that not only are people hungry, they are on flimsy boats, little rafts, literally dying to get into Europe. They are enduring on a daily basis what the Europeans endured for 1 or 2, 3 days last year. There's hunger, and there's disease and massive inequity. And sometimes, when we look at these, we get, someone called it once, compassion fatigue. We think, oh, I can't deal with this, I don't want to see it. But we should see it as a spiritual opportunity. We should perhaps fix on one of those images, perhaps a child. One I'm thinking of was literally dying in its mother's arms in a refugee camp in Europe. And call it during the day and let it trouble us. Because that trouble, that discomfort that we feel when we are living lives of such utter privilege here, that is like the grain of sand in the oyster that creates the pearl. And it's that discomfort that creates true compassion. To allow ourselves to realize, not to be miserable all the time, that's not the point, but that won't help anybody. But to say what can we practically do to assuage this? It's about pain. Look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstances that not to do this to anybody else. Now, we are living in an interconnected world. We're linked together, our economies are so interdependent that when markets fall in one part of the world, stocks plummet all around the globe that day. We all face the same environmental possibility of disaster. We're linked together electronically in a way that would once have been conceivable on the World Wide Web. People can look into their phones now and see the way we live. No wonder they want to come to our privileged world. And yet, the more global we become, the more tribal people want to feel. We've got this ludicrous thing going on, a terribly dangerous thing going on in Britain at the moment. Should Britain leave the European Union? And people are saying absurd things like, oh, we must be proud again. Rubbish. Rubbish. We need Europe. 100 years ago, Europeans were killing one another in these disastrous wars. The fact that we're sitting round table, however ineptly, tackling day-to-day problems is a triumph. Scotland tried to leave the European Union. And the United Kingdom, to go it alone. Fortunately, that did not work out, that wish. So, similarly, in the religious world, the more global our vision comes with interfaith, the more some people want to retreat to denominational ghettos. That's why you have fundamentalism, where people feel threatened by this likeness and want to hold on to this nugget of individuality. But this is not a rational assessment. I think the Dalai Lama has said this. This is not a rational assessment of our current situation, which is interdependence. So the suffering we're seeing in other parts of the world has already redounded on us. And this is in no way condoning these terrorist acts, but this has come from decades of neglect and selfishness and pursuit of the wrong kind of policies, not supporting rulers or regimes in various countries of the world that would give their people none of the liberties that we enjoy. We're not doing it. That's not the golden rule. Don't impose on others, said Confucius, what you yourself do not desire. Now, we had some bad days in Europe. I mentioned them. And this is heartbreaking. One of the things that's happening, you see, is that we are now, in the privileged West, are beginning to endure some of the privations that people in these other countries that we've been helping to keep in this bad state have felt all along. There are certain places now where it's not really safe for us to go on holiday. Our world is beginning to shrink. When we go through the airport, we have all this palaver with, taking our shoes off and looking out, and we all get frightened when something like Egypt Air happens. Is it another terrorist attack? But this is only a pinprick of the fear and lack of freedom that people have round the world, which is these migrants. Now, the Charlie Hebdo massacre in January was it was an atrocious crime. An atrocious crime. But when I saw those European and world leaders linking arms and marching together for freedom and liberté and freedom of expression, I felt quite sick, because many of them, including my own Prime Minister, had, as I say, for decades supported regimes like Saudi Arabia in Muslim-majority countries which allow their people no freedom of expression at all. And we only seem to mourn our own people. A few weeks before that Paris catastrophe, 145 Pakistani children had been shot dead by the Taliban. Just a day or two after, 2,000 villagers, men, women, children, and the elderly, had been slaughtered by Boko Haram. Small, tiny mentions in the press compared with the Paris bonanza. And this is noticed in the Muslim world. The other day, Tori gave us that magnificent talk where she showed the number of people who've died. 90% of the people who have died in Afghanistan and Iraq in the wars were civilians who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, we never really mention them. We quite rightly mourn our dead servicemen who come back from these terrible places and have paid the ultimate price. But we must also remember these others too. Otherwise, it looks as though we think that some lives are more valuable than others. And you know, this is not unnoticed. Just shortly after that Paris catastrophe, I visited Jordan, and I was giving a talk to a small group. It was a closed group, no cameras or anything, they were members of the royal family, diplomats, statesmen, members of the diplomatic community. And one of them, and these were not a bunch of hotheads, one of them was the foreign minister who had brokered the peace treaty with Israel. And he said, you know, the West has lost its humanity. You don't care about our dead. The fact that one of the princesses got up and said, we are also terrorized by these people. Far more Muslims have died at the hands of extremists than Western people. And as I said earlier, that day in Paris was just a pinprick to what these people have been enduring in Syria. Paris would have been an almost daily occurrence. After the last attack, Paris attack in November, 2 days earlier, 44 people in Beirut had been killed by 2 IS suicide bombers. And they were never mentioned. As soon as we died, then up went the tricolor, the French flag on every building. Why not the Lebanese flag too? And the Lebanese noticed it. They said that none of this matters, that we don't matter. This is not a good feeling to spread around the world. We're not seeing that compassion, that fellow feeling. Your pain is my pain. I want to end with a story. Amin has heard it before. I often finish my speeches with it. I haven't done it for some time because I've been concerned with other things like Paris and such. But this is really speaking to us now. It's from Homer's Iliad. It's, as you know, the Iliad tells the story of a small incident in the long 20-year war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And in the course of this terrible warfare, Agamemnon, the king, has a quarrel with his leading warrior, Achilles. And Achilles, in a fit of egotistic pique, marches off to his tent and sulks, and more importantly, he withdraws all his men from the battlefield, from the battle. This is disastrous, absolutely disastrous for the Greek side. Achilles is their star. Nobody can beat him. And in the course of this horror, this mess that's occurred, Achilles' beloved friend Patroclus is killed in a skirmish by Hector, one of the princes of Troy. And Achilles goes mad with guilt, grief, and rage. And he challenges Hector to a duel. The two of them will slug it out. And they do so. The royal family, Hector's family, watch from the Trojan walls. And nobody can beat Achilles, though. And he kills Hector. And then he mutilates the body. He, determined to take revenge, he ties Hector's body onto his war chariot and drags it round and round and round Patroclus' grave. And then he does a terrible thing. He refuses to give the body back to the family for burial. And in Greek terms, that meant that Hector's soul would never know rest, but it would be restless and distressed for all eternity. But then one night, Hector's father, old King Priam of Troy, comes in disguise into the enemy camp. Great danger, great risk. And he finds his way to Achilles' tent, and then he throws off his disguise. And of course, everybody is utterly shocked. Here is the king, the chief enemy in enemy territory. And the old man approaches Achilles. Achilles, who has killed not just Hector, but many others of his sons. And he falls at Achilles. The old man falls at Achilles' feet, hugs, embraces his knees, and weeps. And Achilles looks at the old man, and he remembers his father, and he begins to weep. And Homer says the two men wept together, Priam for Hector and for all the sons that, as he called him at this point, man-slaughtering Achilles had slain. And Achilles, now for Patroclus, now for his father. And then they stop weeping. The Greeks believed that weeping together created a bond between men because it showed the pain that lies at the heart of all our experience, all of us, whatever side we're on. And Achilles, the two men look at these great arch enemies, look into each other's eyes. And Homer tells us that each saw the other as divine, as a god. And then Hector goes. Achilles goes and he brings Hector's body and lays it very tenderly in the father's arms, Priam's arms, because the weight might be too much for him to bear. And that, I think, should be an emblem of our time. Two wounded men, arch enemies, both of whom have damaged each other irreparably, and they're two peoples that have damaged each other irreparably. But they have felt that bond of compassion that unites them, and it is that which makes us truly godlike, truly divine, when we recognize that our so-called enemies also have pain. Thank you.
Now I would like to welcome to the stage Dr. Vivek Murthy, the 19th Surgeon General of the United States, to talk a little bit about loneliness and your work and interests there. Welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. So I'm going to start with a really tough one. How did you get into this?
Well, let me just say how wonderful it is to be here. This is my very first trip to Louisville.
Welcome.
And I'm blessed to be here with my wife, Alice. It's her first trip here as well. And we have just felt so welcomed in this beautiful city by the warm people we've met and have just really enjoyed everyone's hospitality. So thank you. Thank you so much. My journey to work on loneliness is not something I would have predicted a few years ago. When I had to testify in front of the US Senate as part of my confirmation process for being Surgeon General, they asked me, what will your priorities be as Surgeon General? And I will tell you that loneliness was not on my list at that time. But what really happened to me is that I was educated by the communities that I met all across America, whether they were big cities on the coast or small towns in the Midwest or fishing villages in Alaska. I went to many of these communities as part of a listening tour with the simple question, which is how can I help? And I tried as best I could to just sit back and listen to what the answers were. And what I found were many stories that people told, stories of depression, concerns they had about addiction in their community, worries they had about chronic illness not in their neighborhoods, concerns they had about violence and how it would affect their children. But behind many of these stories were also stories of deep pain, a deep emotional pain, not just physical pain. And that pain often manifests as loneliness. Now, no one ever came to me and said, "Hi, my name is Steve and I'm lonely." But what was often unsaid was this deeper pain that was manifesting as loneliness, and it took just a little bit of probing. It took just giving people permission to explore that, for the stories to come forth, and they often did. Stories from men and women, from the elderly and the young, from people from all walks of life, who confessed that they had been struggling with loneliness and they weren't sure what to do about it. Now, what was interesting to me about this is that it actually wasn't the first time I had encountered loneliness. As a doctor caring for patients, I now reflect on the fact that loneliness was the most common pathology that I saw in the hospital, more common than heart disease or diabetes. I had a patient who I was seeing once who won the lottery. Actually, he literally won the lottery. And he had a stream of money coming to him every year. But the first thing he said to me when I walked into the clinic room is he said, "I won the lottery and it was the worst thing that ever happened to me." And I said, "Well, why is that?" And he said, "Well, I had a job I loved and I quit. I had customers who loved and appreciated my work and I lost them. I lived in a neighborhood which was modest. I had a small house, but my neighbors and I knew each other. And I moved to a rich, expensive neighborhood where everyone had big walls between their houses, and now I don't know anyone." And he said, "I became all alone. And that's why winning the lottery was the worst thing that happened to me." But perhaps most personal of all was that I had experienced loneliness myself, and starting from a very young age. I still remember going to school, elementary school, each morning with my parents dropping me off, and feeling this pit growing in the depths of my stomach. And not because I was worried about an exam or because I was worried about homework, but I was worried about feeling alone, when I went to school. And I was a shy kid who wanted to hang out with other kids, but wasn't always sure how to go about doing that. And so I reflected on all of that, and when I was coming toward the end of my time in office and started looking into the science around loneliness, recognizing that loneliness is not just a bad feeling, but it's something that has profound consequences for our health. So people who actually struggle with loneliness have a higher rate of heart disease, dementia, depression, anxiety, but also they seem to live shorter lives. And the amount of longevity that you lose that's associated with loneliness is similar to the mortality impact, if you will, of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's greater than the mortality impact of obesity. And think about how much attention we give to obesity and smoking versus how much we pay to loneliness. So this is what led me to realize that loneliness is not only common, affecting double-digit percentages, of adults in the United States, infecting more people than the number of people who have diabetes in the United States, but it's also consequential for our health. It impacts how we show up in the workplace in terms of our productivity. It impacts how our children are performing in school. And it even contributes, I believe, to a failure of dialogue at a community level. All of us have had the experience of having a bad day at work or at school, going home after that bad day, and then trying to resolve a conflict with a spouse or with a family member. And how many times has that gone really well? Well, I'll tell you from my own personal experience, like having done this, that it doesn't go well. But imagine now a nation of 300 million people who are struggling with challenges with their own emotional well-being, who in many cases are struggling with loneliness, who are then trying to come together and talk about profound challenges like healthcare and climate change and poverty and race. And it's not a massive surprise that those conversations don't go as well as they could. So that is why I came to realize that this is not just an issue, but one of the central issues, I think, of our time, the fundamental question of how do we better connect with each other. And it's why I decided in my time after serving to focus on it, to write a book on it, which I'm working on right now, and to try to do everything I could to create more connection in my life, in the lives of people around me, and hopefully in our community more broadly.
What are the factors that are driving loneliness and the epidemic, at the epidemic sort of levels that we're talking about now?
It's a really interesting question. And I think one thing that's important to know is that loneliness is not a new phenomenon. People have struggled with loneliness for centuries. But it does feel like it has a different flavor today because there are different factors that we're struggling with. So one of the factors is actually is a structural issue, which is that we've actually become far more mobile than we ever were before, which is amazing. I came here to Louisville and it took me 2 hours on a flight. Wow, that's extraordinary. But it also means that we have moved away from the communities that we have known, what we grew up with. Sometimes we move many times over the life course. And that does something. It fractures relationships, and then we end up having to try to rebuild those relationships. The second thing that has happened has been the advent of new forms of technology that have enabled us to communicate in new ways. Now, on the face of it, this should be an outright benefit. But it's been mixed. Sometimes we use technologies in ways that profoundly connect us. I couldn't, for example, talk to my grandmother very much when I was growing up because she was in India and we didn't have FaceTime because it didn't exist. And we didn't have email because that didn't exist either. We would write these letters called aerograms on these blue pieces of paper that some of you may remember that would take 2 weeks to be delivered to India. And you'd buy them from the post office and it was very exciting. But it was certainly not very immediate. And so technology, though, it has a potential to be great. But what has also happened, what matters is it's not really a question of is tech good or bad. It's a question of how do we use technology. Are we using it to optimize connection or not? And if you look at the data around this and you look at the reality of how we're using technology, you see that we're often using it in ways that diminish our connection. We are often distracted, in fact, in talking to people over dinner or just face-to-face by the phones that are vibrating in our pocket or often vibrating face up on a table. We sometimes substitute our in-person, face-to-face interactions for instead online interactions, thinking that, well, if I've got a bunch of friends online and I'm posting on their Facebook wall or, DMing them on Twitter, then that's, I'm still connecting with them. But it's a very different sort of level and quality of connection than engaging with people face-to-face. So technology is important. But I think the last one that I'll mention, I think, is the most vexing and challenging of all, which is culture and how our culture has evolved and shifted over time. And I worry that we have become a culture that has increasingly focused on individualism and that has also increasingly focused on work. And we have not actively said relationships and people are not important, but we've allowed the factors, relationships and people, to slide out of negligence in a sense. If I told people, for example, when 10 years ago, the people I worked with, colleagues I studied with, that I was moving to a small town in Kansas because we had an amazing job opportunity. And I didn't know anyone there. We didn't have any connections. We had lots of family where I lived and we were going to leave them behind. But I had this amazing job opportunity. People would be like, that's amazing, Vivek. Great job. That's just like, go for it. Good, good for you. But if I told them we're moving to a small town in Kansas and actually leaving amazing job prospects behind because we actually have some family in Kansas that we just want to be closer to, people would say, oh, I guess that's all right, but I guess Vivek lost his ambition. Mm-hmm. I guess he's not as driven as he used to be. Those are the code words we use, ambition, driven, etc. But what that tells us really is that we've built a society that's centered around work and accomplishment and reputation, as opposed to a society centered around people. And what we've done is fit people in where it's convenient. But that has taken a toll over time as we've become busier and busier and busier. All of these forces together, I think, have combined to create one of the great ironies of the modern age, which is that we are more connected than ever by technology, but more lonely and disconnected than any of us thought we would be.
And what are the broader societal implications here? You touched on it a little bit, but I think we know generally about the individual implications of loneliness, but what about collectively?
Yeah, so I think this has real profound consequences for society when we're disconnected from each other. And partly because I think we evolved to be, over thousands of years, to be creatures that were truly connected with one another. For example, like 5,000 years ago, if you were disconnected from everyone, if you were just going it alone, then what happened to those people is they usually died. Right. A predator ate them. They starved to death because they had an inconsistent food supply. We depended on other people for protection, for safety, for food and nourishment, both physical food, but also just emotional nourishment as well. And over thousands of years, that became baked into our nervous systems, such that we felt comfortable and at home and in our sort of base state when we were connected. And when we were in fact disconnected, especially for prolonged periods of time, that actually placed us in a physiologic stress state. Now, imagine this, like several thousand years ago, if I was immediately disconnected from my tribe, so to speak, then being in a state of stress and hypervigilance was actually a good thing, right? Because if there was a twig that snapped behind me, even if there was just a 1% chance that was a predator stepping on a branch, I wanted to interpret it as a predator because my life depended on it. But now imagine in 2019, when I'm struggling with loneliness and I'm in a high stress state, in a state of hypervigilance as a result of that, and I start to interpret benign signals around me as threats. You come and ask me if I want to have lunch, and instead of saying, gosh, I was feeling lonely, I'm going to say yes, because I would love the connection. Instead, I say, well, this guy just thinks that, I'm somebody to be pitied. He's probably trying to trap me. He's probably making fun of me or looking down at me in some way. Screw him. I'm not going to go out, go to lunch with him. And that seems like a bizarre reaction because, I should be doing exactly the opposite. But this is this strange cycle that we get into sometimes with hypervigilance. So I think the societal implications are quite broad because when you enter that cycle of loneliness, you can go deeper and deeper and deeper. And if as a society we are pursuing a path that's largely individual, doing our own thing and fitting in people when it's convenient, then more and more people start falling by the wayside, struggling with loneliness and becoming lonelier and lonelier as a result. And that impacts our workplaces. It means that right now, if you look at the data on loneliness, and there's a wide range of prevalence data, meaning that there are some studies that show that loneliness is far more common than others. But even if you take the conservative numbers, it still places loneliness at around 20% among adults in the United States, right? That's a huge, huge number. And that's likely underreported because these are people who are self-reporting loneliness. If you imagine that, then it's almost guaranteed that in all of our workplaces that there are people who are struggling with loneliness. So this impacts the productivity, like in our workplaces. I visited one of the schools yesterday here, in public schools in Engelberg in Louisville that has a compassionate schools project, sort of instituted at that school. And I realized that talking to the teachers and having spoken to teachers at many other schools, that many kids are struggling with loneliness too, and it impacts their academic performance. It impacts the behavioral issues that they struggle with. And what do we do when kids encounter or present with behavioral issues? Well, we try to medicate them. We try to label them as problem children, and we suspend them or push them out of school, which is often the last thing that they need. And so we enter this destructive cycle in terms of how we're dealing with our children. But whether it's the workplace or whether it's in schools, whether it's in society more broadly where people are feeling increasingly separated and distanced from other people, that disconnection affects our ability to function together as a society. Every healthy society depends on its ability to come together during difficult times and address big challenges ahead. Mm-hmm. Because there are tough decisions that we have to make. We can't make everything on short-term cycles. We have to look ahead and make hard decisions now and pay a price now, knowing that we and our children will be better off in 10 years. But we can't make those decisions together if we can't sit together, be connected with each other, and truly listen to each other. And so this is why loneliness is important not just for our individual health, but has really broad implications for how we function as a society.
In your travels, in your studies, in your research, in your experience, what are solutions that you're experiencing?
Yeah, so part of the reason I decided to write a book on this subject, and I'd love to tell you I had this brilliant idea of writing this book from the beginning. Actually, no, I was going to write a different book, and the universe was just hammering me over the head again and again through different people telling me I should write this book, and I kept ignoring it, and finally I realized that this is a book I need to write, not just to share with the world what is happening with loneliness and strategies for how we can address it, but frankly, on a selfish level, I realized that I needed this book too. I needed to do the work of learning how to build a more connected life for myself, for my family, in my own community. And so in the process of doing this, I've actually come across many inspiring solutions. So to me, the issue of loneliness is not a depressing issue. It's actually a very optimistic issue and a heartening issue because I see people all over the country who are starting to recognize the challenge of loneliness, but who are pulling together to try to build stronger neighborhoods and stronger communities. Some quick examples of that. There's a healthcare system that I visited, the Caremore Health System in Southern California, which has recognized that many of their patients are struggling with loneliness, and it impacts their health directly, but also impacts whether they're able and willing to come to the hospital for follow-up appointments. So they set up a togetherness program to allow their employees to connect with patients and then to help them strengthen social connection in their own life more broadly. There's a program I ran into in a school in South Florida called the We Dine Together program, which was started by students who recognize that lunchtime is one of the loneliest times in the school day, because it's when so many children worry that they're not going to have anyone to eat with, and that fear is realized when they're sitting alone at a table. And these kids realized that and decided that they were going to ensure that no child ever had to eat alone if they didn't want to. And so they created a group. And they would actually actively go out and find children who are eating alone and bring them together. And the friendships that have been fostered through that group have been absolutely incredible. And so just like that, there are now companies that I'm coming across that are realizing that connection is important for their workplaces and are embarking on both two things. One is research to understand more broadly who's impacted by loneliness, and are bringing employees together to fashion programs to actually address loneliness there. As promising as these are at a societal level, and they are important because our environment matters a lot in terms of whether we are connected or not, the other thing to remember is that there are choices that we make also about whether or not we are connected to others. And this comes back to one of the ideas we were talking about earlier, which is a choice about whether we live in a work-centered society or a people-centered society. And I think that what I would love to do in my own life, what I would love for all of us to be able to do more and more, is to move toward a people-centered life. And that means recognizing, number one, that we have to be present with the people that we interact. And this device that's in my pocket and in many of our pockets can often distract us from other people. I mean, there's interesting and good data showing that even if you take your phone and put it on silent, but if you leave it on the table during a conversation, you might think, oh, I can just focus on the person in front of me. But the data clearly shows that both people feel worse about the quality of the conversation than if the phone is not there at all, right? So presence matters. And even if we were to say we're going to spend 5 minutes a day focused on the people that we love in our life, that could mean that we look at them face to face and have a real conversation. It could mean that we call our mother or our daughter or our son and have a real conversation with them. It could mean that we FaceTime with a dear friend, and have 5 uninterrupted minutes where we focus on having a real connection. Those small incremental investments make a really big difference. The last piece I should mention around this is that as much as presence is important, as much as I believe we have to reinvest in cultivating empathy in all generations at a time where social media, I think, has actually drained much of our empathy and compassion for others, I also think that one of the most important elements and parts of connecting with other people is being able to connect with ourselves. What I mean by this is that if we do not believe that we matter, if we don't think that we are valued, if we don't think that we belong, it actually makes it harder for us to connect to other people. After all, why would I think that others would want to connect with me if I didn't think I was worthy of connecting with at all? And I worry about this particularly for the younger generation that's in school and in college right now, because unlike older generations before them, they are bombarded through so many different channels with messages that tell them that they are not thin enough, not good looking enough, that they don't have enough friends, that they're not likable enough, that they don't have enough personality, they're not extroverted enough. And what does that do to you as a child when you're constantly being told that you don't have enough? Well, you start to do what some of my friends' children do on Instagram, which is that they never post photos of themselves unfiltered on Instagram. But they use apps to adjust their nose a little bit, to shape their chin a bit, to bring their hairline forward a little bit, to do whatever they want to do to make themselves more attractive, and they post that. And that's just normal. And so building that connection with ourselves is extremely, extremely important. Look, I know that we're actually getting close to our time here, and so this is the last thought I wanted to share, which is that as I think about this larger issue of loneliness and social connection, to me, this is an issue that really strikes at the heart of what we need to be thinking about in the future in terms of what kind of society that we want to build. And one of the core questions I think that it raises for us is, are we willing to be a society where we take care of each other? Because as important as technological solutions are, there are old medicines that I believe we have forgotten at times. And one of those is the power of looking out for each other, of caring for each other, of being there for each other. And I'm often reminded of when I think about that, I'm often reminded of a father who I met several years ago, who tragically lost his son in the horrific Newtown shooting, where a shooter took the lives of so many innocent children in an elementary school and their teachers. And this man's name was Mr. Barden. His son was Daniel Barden. And Daniel was 6 years old when he was killed. But his father said to me that even though he was only 6, that he would go to school every day. And at lunchtime or during recess, he would always look out to see which kids were eating alone or playing alone. And he would go up to them, and he would talk to them. Or sometimes he wouldn't talk to them. Sometimes he would just literally sit next to them. And nobody taught Daniel how to do that. That was instinctual. He was born with that kind of empathy. And I think most of us are born with that kind of empathy. The path to building a more connected society is not a path to transform people into something they're not. It is a quest to return ourselves to who we ultimately were and always have been. Just beings who are empathic, who are compassionate, who in their best moments do in fact look out for each other. I was reminded of how important it is to look out for each other just 2 months ago on a very personal level when my wife and I woke up one morning on a Saturday. And we, as we always do, we're playing with our children in the morning, our 2.5-year-old and our 14-month-old. And we noticed that our 14-month-old daughter was not putting her right leg down. She was not weight-bearing on the right. And we grew very concerned. Her older brother and her had been horsing around a lot, and we didn't know if she had injured her knee. And then we started to have scarier thoughts, which is one of the dangers about being in the medical profession, is sometimes you think about the worst. But we started wondering, well, does she have an infection in the joint? Is something more sinister going on? And so we rushed her to the emergency room, and we waited there, trying to figure out, as the doctors did tests, what was actually happening. And I will tell you that it doesn't matter if you're a doctor, it doesn't matter if you're the Surgeon General. There's no other role that you occupy in a situation like that other than being a scared parent. Mm-hmm. Because there's no amount of medical training that makes a difference in those moments. And that's what was happening to Alice and me. We were deathly scared something was wrong. Now the doctors came and poked and prodded. They pressed on her leg, could clearly see that there was point tenderness, something was happening in the leg, but the ultrasound, the x-ray weren't telling them what it was. Now they needed to get an MRI ultimately, which meant that given that she was so young, they had to put her to sleep completely for the MRI so she wouldn't move. And they didn't have somebody on staff to do that because it was a weekend, it was actually a long weekend. And so they were scrambling to figure out how can they pull the right people together so anesthesia could be there and the operator could be there and everyone could coordinate to get this all done. But we were faced with the prospect that she may need to wait a day or even 2 to get this scan. And our worry was that if there was an infection sitting there, a day or 2 could be catastrophic for her. And so we waited and we hoped and we prayed that she would be able to get this scan soon. And the hospital moved mountains and they brought the right people in eventually and they were able to get this scan. And when they got this scan, we saw her finally being wheeled out of the room, the MRI suite. We were desperate just to go there, to hold her, to touch her, make sure she was okay. But before we could do that, the doors opened and a team of surgeons swooped in. And they said, we've looked at the scans already. And we see that she has an abscess, a collection of bacteria, that's at the far end of her thigh bone, her femur. And it's right up against the growth plate. And they said, we need to get in urgently. We need to take her to the operating room and drain that and clean it out right now. And I mean, it was probably one of the scariest moments, of our life. But they took her in. Thankfully, they were able to wash it out completely. They were able to identify which bacteria was actually growing, get her on the right antibiotics. And I remember the next day, one of the doctors came by, and we realized that he had been instrumental in helping to pull all the pieces together so she could get the scan. Because when we went down to the radiologist to talk to them to look at the scan, the radiologist said, wow, this is right there against the growth plate. If you had waited 24 hours more, it could have invaded the growth plate. And for all we know, that could have affected her growth in her leg. And so when this doctor came by, we were just thanking him profusely. We said, thank you so much for being there and for helping us get our little girl cared for in the way that she needed. And after my I was completely inarticulate. I was just, couldn't say anything but thank you, thank you, thank you. And I was like, had tears, I was like blubbering, I was just a mess. And he finally just stopped me and put his hand on my shoulder and he said, Vivek, he said, there's no need to thank me. He said, Vivek, you're one of us. And when he said that, it made me feel like I belonged. It made me feel like there were people who cared for us and who were looking out for us. And it didn't escape me that there are so many times in all of our lives where we walk through the dark hallways of life feeling that we're alone, that there isn't someone to take care of us. The extraordinary thing about this is that what he did in that moment is he allowed himself to express his love for us through the service that he provided. And what we have realized, like in our own lives, ever since we found out that we were pregnant with our first son, is we've realized that the most fundamental question, the most fundamental issue of our time that's going to determine whether or not our children have a safe environment to grow up in is the question of what happens in this deep struggle that's happening in our country and our world between love and fear. Because that is the truth, is that we are locked in this deep struggle between love and fear. And this fear manifests in lots of different ways. It's showing up as insecurity, as anger, as jealousy, as rage. But the love shows up as well, as kindness, as compassion, as empathy, as generosity. And we realize that as much as our instincts and who we are is to be beings of love, that many people in our country are living in a place of fear. And many of us, if not all of us, are having many moments where we are living in that fear as well. It's affecting our lives, it's affecting our communities, and it's affecting our country and the world. And so the question that I think is the most important for us to ask ourselves is, what are we going to do to tip the scales away from fear and towards love? What are the decisions we are going to make in how we live our life, in terms of where we put our attention? What are the decisions we're going to make about what we decide to do with our careers, about how we decide to get involved in our communities that will help shift, through the power of our example and involvement, those scales away from fear and toward love? And I know this is not an easy thing to do, but I have come to believe that love is not a source of weakness, that it's not something that's sappy or something that drains us of our strength. But love is, in fact, the greatest source of strength we have. It's what enables us to go above and beyond as parents, as family members, as friends, as community members, and do things that nobody would ever, quote unquote, rationally do, but which love guides us to do. And if you ever doubt the power of love, if you ever have those moments where you're skeptical that the love that you have to offer can ever change the world, there's a very simple thing you can do that just takes 10 seconds. Take your hand and hold it up in the air for a moment. Now take that hand and put it over your heart. And close your eyes for a moment. I want you to think about the people in your life who have showered you with unconditional love. The people who have been there for the dark moments and for the great triumphs. People who have been there during your moments of doubt and confusion. The people who have believed in you, even when you weren't sure if you believed in yourself. The people who help to remind you of just who you are. Think about the love that they have given you, about the strength that that has afforded you, about the courage that that's given you, about the peace that it's surrounded you with. Open your eyes. And what you felt in those 10 seconds, that is the power of love. That is what love can do for us. That is how love can transform lives at scale. We don't need training or special education or degrees to figure out how to love. We just need to remember who we fundamentally are. And as a doctor who spent many years training and who's written prescriptions for complex medications that are the result of amazing scientific breakthroughs, I will tell you that there is nothing that I have ever prescribed that is nearly as powerful as love. Love is the oldest medicine we have. It is the most powerful source of healing that we have as well. And so my ask of you as you go forth to your lives in Louisville and across the country is to think about how you can be a force that can shift those scales away from fear and towards love. To think about how you can by doing so, create a more vibrant community for your children, for my children, and for all of us. Because the truth is that whatever faith system you belong to, whether it's an organized religion or whether you choose to put your faith in the broader universe or in an entity that has no name, the truth is that the faith that brings all of us together, the faith that we have to remember more urgently now than ever before, is our shared humanity. That's the most powerful connection between us. That's what we have to remember if we want to address loneliness in America and around the world. It's the foundation on which we build everything else. So I want to thank you all so much for the time and the attention that you've given to these issues today. Everything that we have talked about today and yesterday, these are at the heart of not just what ails us, but what we need to focus on to create a more healthy, vibrant society. And if we give our attention to each other and look out for each other, if we choose to believe in the power of love over fear, if we choose to recognize that we are not broken, but that we are whole, and it is when we forget our wholeness that we experience pain, then we can hopefully return to who we really are, beings of love and compassion, beings who have the power to heal and to build the kind of world that all of us deserve. Thank you all so much.